Welcome to Lead Wisely by WonderTour. We're back again this week in our villain series. We're wrapping it up talking about the titular villain, Sauron. We got to see this awesome fleshed out version of kind of the history and the buildup of Sauron in the Rings of Power. So we're mostly going to be focused on the Rings of Power season 1 and 2 in this episode. Brian, we always start off with a tough question about leadership. He's a villain, but talk to me about Sauron's leadership superpower.
Yes, I love this. How to lead through influence the Sauron way. What we see in this series, we're going to talk a little bit both about Sauron's relationship with Galadriel, the elven hero, and his relationship with Celebrimbor, the elven smith, and maybe even touch on his relationship with Adar, who's the leader of the orc tribes in this framing. And the thing that we see Sauron doing really well is sort of living up to his master of deception, his Lord of Lies sort of billing, but in a way that you might not expect. He forges genuine connections with the people that he's influencing. And he is incredibly good at it. His superpower is listening. His superpower is understanding what their intrinsic motivations are, what their dreams about the future are, what things they're scared about, what they really would work infinitely hard to achieve. And then aligning himself with that and figuring out how to shape it just enough so that it achieves his goals at least as much as it achieves theirs. So very briefly, over the course of these two seasons, in the first season, he encounters Galadriel, and she, of course, thinks he's a human named Halbrand. But what Galadriel wants most of all is to actually defeat Sauron, but to keep the elves safe, to be a hero who kind of, protects the world. And she's incredibly motivated to go clear out the Southlands and reclaim them for men and kind of, restore order to the kingdoms. And so he senses this, like he very easily detects that she has this willingness to work incredibly hard. She's been pursuing this for like 1,000 years, and she's not going to stop. She's incredibly isolated. Her king isn't supporting her. Her friends aren't supporting her. Her followers have left her. They tried to send her to a retirement community, and she jumped off a boat in the middle of the ocean to swim back. Like so she's A, incredibly motivated, and B, kind of on her own. And she desperately is open to the idea of an ally who encourages her. And then over the course of the season, he drops enough hints that she concludes that he's actually the Lord of the Southlands and he could help her out by being the king. And then she talks him into doing the thing that he wants to do, which is go back to Mordor and turn it into Mordor. In the second season, he latches on at the end of the first season, and then through the second season, he latches on to this great elven smith, Celebrimbor, and senses that Celebrimbor's ambition is to be even greater than his grandfather, to be the greatest smith of all time, and to craft the most amazing things that ever been made. And so he talks him into making these rings of power. First as Halbrand, and then later he comes back as this, disguised as this elven emissary, Anatar. But he correctly detects that Celebrimbor's weakness and his motivation is his pride and his, wanting to be great and wanting to lean into his skills. And so through his superpower of listening and being sensitive to what people want, he manages to kind of get them pointed in a direction that he can find useful. And this is not a Hans Gruber, incredibly brittle, incredibly detailed point-by-point plan where he's caring about what people are going to do. This is a reacting to the opportunities that are presented to him and pulling on the biggest levers he can find, like aligning himself to the most powerful people he can find, and then getting them to push the world in a direction that he wants, which is a very cool and very different take on the supervillain mythology. So what did you see in these, Drew?
Brian, what does his name mean? He gives himself this elven name, Anatar.
Yes, and the inside baseball Tolkien version of this, Anatar translates to Lord of Gifts, I think, or Bringer of Gifts, which is fun both from the, like, here, I'm giving you this thing that you want, I'm helping you get the thing you want, but also works in the sense of gifts as in talents, where he's really encouraging Galadriel and Celebrimbor to lean into their innate talents, to the things that they wanted to be good at anyway, to be heroic warriors, to be, incredibly the most talented technologist of the Elven Age, as it were.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about in the second episode kind of the downfall of that, but it is really cool. I think you did a great job of explaining he has this amazing ability to connect with people And it almost seems genuine because I think it is in a way. He does have genuine connection, definitely with Galadriel, but maybe even with Celebrimbor. He's passionate, he's excited about it, he's working with him. The problem is that it's always disordered, right? It's like his relationship with them is always subservient to whatever his overall purpose is. And so whenever he has to make a decision of what he's going to do, he will absolutely sacrifice that relationship if it is going to help him achieve his purpose.
But I totally agree. He seems to form sincere connections. People, they feel seen as a modern phrase, right? Like Galadriel's like, finally somebody understands what I'm trying to accomplish. Finally, I've got a friend who will ride into battle with me. And Celebrimbor is like, finally, I've got an equal who can relate with me on this very important work. That relationship seems genuine. I think he genuinely enjoys riding around with Galadriel. He genuinely enjoys nerding out about smithy technology with Celebrimbor. Like, I think that's sincere. But he's got his set of motivations, and what he's doing is he's figuring out how to get them to just like run incredibly hard at the thing that he wants them to do anyway. So that's what we see as kind of, like you said, the failure mode, or the side effect of that, though, is that they tend to draw away from other people in their orbits, right? Because he's encouraging them to be all about themselves, which we've talked about many times on WonderTour is not, it's not about you is the lesson that the leaders have to learn. He's encouraging them to make it about them. It's all about you, Galadriel. You have the vision. You understand the risk. You should solve this problem. It's all about you, Celebrimbor. You are the only one that could possibly make these magical artifacts, right? And so they tend to disregard the advice of the people that they should be trusting. They tend to disregard the advice of the people that they have been historically connected to. Celebrimbor alienates all of his followers, and so that's the warning sign, I think. But the connection is still genuine. The connection is there. They are sincerely aligned on some piece of the mission, and that's hard to break, right? You can get people to work incredibly hard with you and for you if they believe in a thing above themselves, that they're trying to achieve.
Brilliant, Brian. Well, we're going to continue to dive deeper into this as we go into our mountaintop. But first, let's hit the intro.
Hi, I'm Brian Nutwell.
And I'm Drew Paroz.
And we are on a journey to lead wisely, to become better leaders by touring fantastic worlds and inspiring lore by going on a wonder tour.
We connect leadership concepts to story context because it sticks to our brains better. You can find out more at WonderTourPodcast.com or by searching on YouTube, Lead Wisely, all one word.
So let's get back to the episode here. Drew, talk to me a little bit about how Sauron plays this game. Because he's clearly kind of playing a game, right? He's riding the currents of the world around him, and he's got a high-level goal at the end of it. But what's he doing here? How is he approaching the world that the opportunities?
Yeah, he does something totally different than most of the other leaders that we look at. We looked at Hans Gruber from Die Hard as the master planner. We looked at the Riddler in the Batman and see how he, once again, he's always trying to stay a couple steps ahead of everybody else. Of course, anytime that you're playing a game, you want to be steps ahead of other people. So Sauron's not against doing that. In fact, he is staying a couple steps ahead. But the types of steps he's ahead are very different. And I think it's fitting that this is our final villain that we look at in this series, because he is obviously more nefarious than any of the villains that we've looked at thus far. But more than that, he is perhaps the most skilled of all of them in that in a way, right, he's like a lower god. He's a Maya in the Lord of the Rings lore. So he is extremely powerful, but we don't see him until the end of season 2 even start to leverage that power outright. Up until that point, he's just very subtly using that power and primarily using just basic strategies. He just looks for what is the biggest thing. Like you said in your response to the question, what is the biggest thing? What's the biggest lever I can pull? And how do I get access to it as fast as possible? And so he sees that with Galadriel. It's like, hey, Galadriel is under-leveraged and extremely powerful, right? She comes from a powerful line of elves, and she holds influence with the elves. How do I influence her? And that's basically the simplicity of his strategy. And like, look at how he interacts with Adar. Adar is probably his, up until the end of season 2, his number one nemesis, right? He
Right.
is a very spiteful person, and Adar obviously robs him of what he thought was his when Morgoth dies, or gets, I guess he doesn't really die, right? He gets taken back and imprisoned for eternity by the Valar. But either way, after Morgoth, he thinks he's going to step up. Adar stabs Morgoth's crown into his back and stops him. And so he is coming after Adar, but he doesn't have this incredibly complex strategy of how he's going to come and take Eragion, and then he's going to use it to destroy Adar. Everything is just simple, right? It's okay, well, we'll get him here, and then I will be able to, within a certain range, exert influence over his troops. And he'll be angry, so he'll be making less than optimal decisions and be susceptible to, his Sauron is the deceiver. He'll be susceptible to his deceptions, which is eventually how he kills Adar.
Right.
And it's that simple.
Right. Yeah, well, and what I love about this is that we can sort of forecast forward to the Lord of the Rings, where he's standing up in the tower, or the the battle that's coming, where he's wearing the One Ring and he's got his armies around him. But he's not at that point yet. He is, with the exception of the flashback where Adar betrays him, right? We don't see him trying to exert leadership at all. Like, he's learned this lesson that he's not yet powerful enough to exert leadership by influence. Even when he makes a stirring speech, the orcs are like, "You're not one of us," and he gets betrayed and they try to murder him. Right. So he spends both of these entire seasons not putting himself in a position of authority, rejecting authority. Like, Galadriel has to talk him into being willing to be the king of the Southlands, right? He is working shoulder to shoulder with the people that he wants to influence. He's putting himself in their shoes, subservient to them, as a person who seems like, I need your help. You're the one that's going to solve all these problems. You are the leader. He's kind of, he's almost a little bit of an Obi-Wan for Celebrimbor, right? He's trying to be more mentoring. He's trying to be more of an ally for Galadriel, and not to exert power at all. So he's working entirely through influence, and he's working entirely not even through making a detailed plan, like you say, but just like suggesting every once in a while, like, "Hey, have you thought about this? Like, oh, have you looked at the world that way? Oh, maybe you should be worried about this," right? And so what we see is that as people become more attached to him and more trusting of him, then he's able to pull the wool over their eyes, right? He's able to change their perception of reality more and more effectively, to the point by the end of the second season, he is literally weaving magic or changing the world that Celebrimbor sees. But he doesn't start that way, and he never positions himself as, "You must do this thing," until he feels like he's got enough power to say, "All right, I'm tying you to your forge and you got to go do the thing."
He's incredibly patient. He is absolutely playing the long game. And like you said, he tried to play the short game initially, learned that that wasn't going to work. And so now this attempt to take all the power, he's going to play the long game. And in doing so, he's going to create these rings. These rings allow him to play the long game in a new way, where before, his body was able to be destroyed. And so he ends up in this weird goop that has to like
Yeah.
make a comeback that takes a really long time to reconsolidate power. And we see that again in the Third Age, right? In the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, is he's back in that state where he's having to reconsolidate power. We get that in the Hobbit at one point where they're like, Sauron's back, and they go to
Right.
I forget what the name of the castle is that they go to, where he's got his minions and stuff like that. But he has figured out the way to do it, and it's by leveraging big picture thinking. He's always thinking big, and he's allowing the picture to evolve in front of him. He's not getting locked in too much on one vision or one strategy. He's just allowing the big rocks to fall as they will, and everything else he'll just kind of figure out as he goes. So let's talk about the mountaintop so that we can dig into this maybe a little bit more. So Brian, why don't you tell us about this week's mountaintop with Celebrimbor?
So we talked about Sauron working through influence. We talked about the way that he works through influence is aligning big picture goals that the person already had, their intrinsic motivations, the things that they want to achieve. And the way that he corrupts those big picture goals is that he makes them selfish. He encourages other people to be very self-centered and very narrow focused in pursuing their goals, to the point where they start to lose context, and then he can really guide the way that they're going. And so the greatest example of this is about halfway through season 2, Celebrimbor has been creating these rings, and he's been told to stop by his king, and he's, there's some warning signs going around. And Sauron sort of pitches we need to make more rings very mildly, but in a way that is very motivational. And Celebrimbor, on his own initiative, writes a letter to his king saying, "Oh, everything's fine, and we've stopped making the rings, and we thank you for your advice, and we're following everything you said." And then goes and does the exact opposite. And he's abandoning his principles at that moment. He's abandoning his people. He's abandoning his loyalties. He's abandoning kind of good sense, listening to the people you should probably be listening to, in favor of listening to this voice that's telling him to do the thing that he really wanted to do anyway. But he's crossed over from not really thinking about the context to actually putting up firewalls, to lying to people about it. And so this is our moment where this character is influenced to the point where he starts to make really bad decisions, right? And starts to, even in the terminology of the series, right, he introduces corruption into his product. He's no longer of pure mind trying to do this for the benefit of the world. He's convinced himself that the ends justify the means. And so now he's starting to change the way that he interacts with those around him. And from this point forward, Celebrimbor pushes his workers incredibly hard, and they go from sort of adoring him to being really frustrated, why aren't you listening to us? This isn't going well, right? He loses the trust of his followers. He loses awareness of reality, and he starts doing increasingly harmful things in the world with all of the real power and real skill that he's developing. So this is our mountaintop moment, is the point at which Celebrimbor starts to abandon his principles.
And the way that he influences, this is where we want to learn. I think there's two things for us to learn here, at least right now, that I'm seeing. One is, how do we influence like Sauron, but not do it in a manipulative way, not do it so that somebody is able to just get short-term gains out of it, but to help them achieve long-term goals. And I think part of it is he really, like you said, he helps them even to understand what their value proposition is. And we can apply this to business. What value are you trying to get? And when we say value, we don't necessarily mean a dollar amount, because most of us, a dollar amount is just a means to have some sort of an experience. It's a means to some sort of a ideal world of flourishing, whatever it is, depending on the goal there. But
Right.
So he helps them to find that value that they're looking for. So in the situation with Celebrimbor, right, what's valuable to him is to have his name in the history books. And he just twists it just a little bit, because that's what a deceiver does. There's nothing wrong with Celebrimbor having his name in the history books, right? In fact, he could do it for a really good reason. He could have his name in the history books because he created something that helped humans and elves or whoever else to flourish.
Right.
But he kind of just slowly turns it so that he loses sight of that. So for us, it's so important to be able to do both things, to help somebody to understand their value statement, make sure our organizations have a clear understanding of what does the user want? What do our customers actually want out of this? Do we understand that? And then beyond that, and this is the magnanimous aspect of it, not just to capitalize on that and then slowly, well, if I do the marketing this way, if I do that, but instead, what type of a world are we creating? And is this world going to create more freedom for the person, for our customer, for our user? Or is it going to create less freedom for them? And that's a hard question to answer sometimes.
Right. No, I think that's right, is that we see on-screen direct influence where he encourages these people to do things that they sort of wanted to do already, but to sort of lose track of the big picture while they're doing it. Once they bought into oh, I must be doing the right thing, once they get very focused on the task at hand, he sort of, helps them lose track of the fact that they might be drifting away from doing the right thing, right? To some extent, that short game versus long game is the same effect that the rings are having, right? Giving all the dwarf lords rings makes them very focused on wealth and power in the extreme short term, and makes then sort of they lose track of what, whether they're giving up some of their authority. Celebrimbor loses track of oh, these things aren't having the effect that I wanted.
Okay, so how does that play out then? he understands somebody's value proposition, which we can also do. We need to understand their
Right.
value proposition, but then he's able to use that. He's able to use the big levers rather than using all these complex strategies that a lot of these other leaders use that become brittle.
Yeah, I think that's the big takeaway here is the idea that you can use a big picture context and align it with people's intrinsic motivations. If you can do that, if you can position, it's not really even about positioning yourself. It's about presenting a vision of the future that aligns with people's intrinsic motivations. If you can do that, they will work incredibly hard in that direction. Like as a good leadership lesson, that's valuable, right? That's actually what really great leaders would do. If you think of somebody that's inspirational, if you think of a Martin Luther King or a John F. Kennedy or somebody who's like really good at standing up and saying, let's go this way, or this is the thing you wanted anyway, let's go do that. We should go to the moon. That would be so cool. We could go to the moon, and we have to beat the Soviets. That would be so important. We have to beat the Soviets, right? People thought those things were great anyway, and so they were able to kind of get spun up on them and the compelling vision. Like that is the positive lesson from this style of leadership. And the other positive lesson, I think, is willingness to work shoulder by shoulder, the willingness to not present yourself as a director authority, but as a co-conspirator or an ally or an advisor is a style of leadership that allows people to feel very empowered. And that part is good, right? Getting people to work on things that they're passionate about is important. Getting people to feel like they're empowered is important. Right. What we see Sauron doing is very skillfully here is then twisting it to his own ends, which is maybe not what we desire in our magnanimous leaders. But I think that's the fun part about watching this evolution is this idea that he is actually very, very good at what he does. And like you said, unlike the Hans Gruber plan from Die Hard or the Silva plan from Skyfall or the Riddler plan for Batman, it's not brittle. It's not a very specific plan that requires other people to behave in specific ways. And it's not short-term focused on just achieving this one thing. It's high level and it's iterative and it's reactive and it's robust. And so that's what makes him one of the most compelling villains I think that we've studied.
Yeah, and it does relate back to Silva in Skyfall. We talked about simple strategy. This is the simplest of strategies. And I think this leads us to our practical application where we can talk about, are big levers the only thing that matters in the end? Obviously, you have to do a lot of small things in order to be able to get enough leverage to get the big lever to budge.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, are the big levers what organizations should be focused on? And is it a risk or a defect in the organization when there is not enough focus on the big levers, not enough clarity on what the big levers are?
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about that?
I like the big levers idea because I think that you can't get the extra effort without knowing what the big levers are, without aligning to the big picture, but also people having a sense that what they're doing is actually really transforming their experience. But I think also the classic lesson of like don't work on the little stuff, right? The thing that's going to unlock a different future are the things that are really standing in your way, getting them out of the way, moving the big rocks as they say or whatever, right? So that's what we see really skillfully here is like what are the main things that that need to have happen that don't have, that are not in the world today, that Sauron is able to influence people to do. He's very good at that. I think we have some examples of both organizations that were very short-term focused over their long-term gain, right? That sort of fell victim to that deception, and examples of organizations that did a very good job of aligning those factors and about kind of pushing the big levers to get really outsized changes in the world. So do you want to talk about some examples here?
Yeah, let's just talk about the SpaceX example. And it's an easy one to pull from because they do innovative things and they are able to do them in a way that it seems like no other company would be able to pull off. But the whole chopsticks catching the reusable rocket was truly one of the most incredible things I've ever seen from a technological perspective. It just seems like it should not be possible. And the fact that they're able to do that so quickly, you have to question, okay, what can I learn from this, right? And as we apply it to our conversation about big levers, the thing here is, what is their KPI? What is their target?
Yes.
What are they
Yes.
trying to do? Well, really, they're trying to do a very simple thing. They're trying to reduce the cycle time, meaning they can launch more rockets faster, which will allow them to gain dominance, which will allow them to make quicker gains, right? The more you can iterate, the faster you can learn, the more advancement you can make, the more money you can make, etc. And in doing that, shorter cycles also lower your expense, they lower your costs. So
Right.
it ends up being this incredible goal. But Brian, that's not really the big lever that everybody gets excited about. People are not lining up to work at SpaceX because they're thinking, oh, we can shorten the cycle time to be able to launch these rockets. We can increase the efficiency of getting objects into lower Earth orbit.
Yeah, exactly. So this is great. Like the technological achievement of I can catch a rocket which lands on its tail with the all of the control skill that requires is sort of that's the crafting the rings, right? Nobody woke up in the morning and say I want to catch a rocket by landing, by landing it on thruster downwards, right? The business unlock is reusable rockets for low cost and low cycle time, so we can put a lot of stuff in low Earth orbit. Like that's what's allowed that SpaceX to be an incredibly powerful organization, and what's now inspired a bunch of other people to try to do sort of similar things, right? But what people get up in the morning are like, I want to make Star Trek. Like I want spacefaring humans. I want a colony on Mars. I want to repopulate the moon and live in the moon base, right? That's the big picture goal of like we should get off of this planet and we should be the technological species that lives in the science fiction worlds that we've all been watching movies and reading books about for 100 years. That's the high level goal that SpaceX and Elon Musk as the kind of founder CEO character tapped into. And so the people that are working at SpaceX, most of them are people who are like, this is awesome. This is what I want to do is I want to build Star Trek. Right? Like
Yeah.
I want to build that future. And then as a way to that, the only way we get to that future is if the cost comes way down and the reusability, the cycle time goes way down. So the only way we get to that is if we can reuse rockets and if we can do all these other crazy technological challenges. Now I'm going to work incredibly hard on that. That's my ring of power that I'm building, is I'm going to do that thing, but not because that thing was what I am intrinsically motivated about. What I'm intrinsically motivated about is building this grand future that I'm now bought into. That unlocks incredible creativity. It unlocks incredible initiative. It unlocks incredible, willingness to work over and above the come in and put your clock and work for 8 hours a day situation. And if you can do that successfully, then yeah, you can unlock substantial changes in the world, right? Our ability to put things in near Earth orbit, our ability to iterate on spaceflight has moved faster in the last 15 years than in probably the 30 years before that.
Yep. I think that's a perfect example. This really did nail it. I like how you bring that back and talk about it in terms of rings of power. That is exactly right. So I think the challenge to each of us is to consider within our own businesses, what would that look like? What are the big levers? What is the metric that you're trying to go towards? But more than that, what is that value proposition that you can get people to rally behind? And of course,
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about that, there's going to be a risk because we're not outright comparing Elon to Sauron, but also when we talked about the leadership superpowers that Sauron has, it was the most obvious comparison that we could make. So
There are people who make that comparison. Let's just say it out loud. WonderTour is not today saying Elon Musk is Sauron. However, he's clearly using some of the same techniques. So you can draw your own conclusions.
So, in the next episode, Brian, we're going to talk about how we do that in a magnanimous way. And I think we've tried to so far this episode, but I think we
Right.
really need to think about then in this next episode how not to fall into the trap of becoming like Sauron. Or, when we look up to a leader at the company, we look up to a leader in the world that is using this big lever strategy. How do we know if this is like a righteous person to follow, if this is a thing that we should be actually putting our effort behind, if it's really going to make a change that's going to make an impact for people?
Right. Yeah. I don't feel that I am at personal risk of becoming a Sauron, but I am absolutely at personal risk of being a Celebrimbor. Right. Head down, working on my forge really hard. This is going to be amazing. I'm never looking up. I'm not thinking about my context. So next episode, we'll talk a little bit about how to not to do that.
Brian, we're going to build the next black box algorithm, and it's going to keep people inside their houses 24 hours a day. But somehow there's a silver lining on this.
Exactly. Yes. Virtual reality is going to be great. You never have to leave the house. I have a question. All right. So looking forward to that discussion. We will continue our leadership lessons from Sauron next week, and then that will wrap up our villains series, and we will pivot to a new theme. We're looking forward to next week's episode where we talk a little bit about how not to follow the Saurons of the world. I hope you enjoyed this one. Thank you so much for joining us. And just remember, as always, character is destiny.